Welcome, everyone. I know it's been a long day with a lot of food for thought, so I'm not going to go into introducing our two very brilliant speakers whose books I've had real pleasure to read and learn from. And I wish I had read them before I wrote mine. That's all I can say. But we are going to talk about the body of water. And the body of water that India knows best is the Indian Ocean. And Indian Ocean, of course, in all its forms. You have the Eastern Indian Ocean, which takes from Bay of Bengal all the way to the Straits of Malacca, and the Western Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, and as you go further down. And there have been patterns of people going from one part to another. And it's a very nice and neat division because Sunil's book focuses on the East and the relationship that has been developed between people who went and came, and what kind of a symbiotic relationship that formed. And Amrita has actually looked at other kind of relationships that became when Indians started exploring basically Africa, but also Mauritius, the island of Mauritius. So we'll go into that. So my first question is this, that both of you have written about people by focusing on the so-called marginal people, those who are not at the center. Histories are written by the white man, or sometimes white women, and people in power, those who control the narratives. But you have pieced together fragments of stories, either through things that you, in your case, Hikayat, the Sajara Malayu and books like that, and in your case, by literally picking up archival documents and letters and retrace the journey of your great-grandfather. So tell me the process. How do you write the story as you go about when you have a deep background knowledge of the history surrounding it, and the role of a person who might seem very insignificant, but who actually is very important?
I suppose in some ways this has been the challenge for several generations of historians who've wanted to try to write the histories of those who leave fewer traces in the archive. And then when they're also mobile, I think it becomes even more complicated. When they're traversing across boundaries, across oceans, and they're leaving such fragmentary traces. And so I think my approach was really like a collage or a patchwork. And the thing with my book, Crossing the Bay of Bengal, is that most of the individuals I mention in the book, all I know about them is the little trace that I find. And so all those threads run cold at some point. Mm-hmm. There are very few characters whose lives I'm able to trace from beginning to end in that book. It's really about these fleeting moments where people leave a trace of themselves.
So how do you do the links?
Yeah. And I think the links come from layering. It's putting as many of these different stories together as I can. That was my approach in that book, but I think it would be very interesting to hear from Amrita, who also has a central character that you're following.
And the interesting part about the central character in Amrita is, of course, there is a blood lineage. She is a great-granddaughter about the person she writes about. But interestingly, she weaves a fascinating story of Surat, of Bombay during the cotton boom and the collapse after the Civil War, Mauritius, South Africa, and gives a very rich picture about that time. So how did that happen?
So I had this, the provocation for this book was I had a great-grandfather who I knew as a child that he had gone to South Africa as a young man and come back. And he had met a woman along the way who gave birth to my grandmother, about whom we knew nothing, who she was, what her name was, how old she was, nothing at all. So the possibility was that there had been some Gandhi connection that, and my great-grandfather.
So you're talking about 1890s to 1910s.
Yes, but I didn't know at that time.
Right.
When I started out, I actually had no idea when he had gone. We had no letters, there were no traces, nobody ever talked, there were no anecdotes, nothing. And so it started out being just this personal sort of, I had an idea that if I started investigating this, it would be a story about finding things, about the process of research itself. But I didn't really know where it was going to lead me. And as I started, I just went off to South Africa. I started with a lead from Gandhi's newspaper, which mentioned my great-grandfather's name. That was a very lucky kind of break because then I got a date. I knew that he was in jail during the Satyagraha movement. at a certain time. So I had that little bit to build on. And I went to South Africa in 2013 in January for the first time. And I stumbled upon archival evidence. I realized that my great-grandfather had left lots of traces of his activities all over the archives in South Africa. And that was, it was a huge thing, for an insignificant person to have, but so I started piecing together the story. And as I started piecing together the story, what happened was that I started understanding the larger history of migration. We know the Gandhi story very well. We know that Gandhi went to South Africa, and he faced racism, and he started the Satyagraha movement, and evolved into the leader that he came back as. But we don't know why he went. We don't know what was the context of his life there. Who were the people surrounding him? We know everything through the Gandhi biography. My story became a kind of parallel story. It connects with Gandhi, but then it tells the much larger story around of migration. And so the decision to enter that larger history, I was led to it rather than, I didn't exactly plan it.
So my next question is, and there is no binary here, but I'm curious, what accounts for the act of migration? Is it a push factor or is it a pull factor? Is it always both? Does something become a justification afterwards?
I think that's maybe the single hardest question to answer, and it's not only hard for us to answer, I think it's hard for people themselves to answer. So when I was doing oral history work in Malaysia with former plantation workers, most of whom had moved to Malaysia in the 1930s, the hardest question to answer is, why did you come? Because that immediately, and it's also the most interesting question, because it immediately leads to multiple stories, which are sometimes irreducibly individual and idiosyncratic. It was a house fire. It was a dream. It was the labor recruiter coming and making promises. And then I think the push and the pull really just start to converge. I think there is no question that a lot of the migrants that I write about in my work were poor, rural, under relations of debt to the labor recruiter, often already indebted farming families. And so in that sense, no doubt there are many, many constraints on their journey. And yet even those from those circumstances are not necessarily telling their stories as victims of circumstance. I mean, there's a very strong sense of agency that comes out of that.
And what do you think led Mohanlal to leave?
Well, so Mohanlal specifically, before that, so there was this whole movement of indentured workers.
Yeah.
And I think they would have been the push factor, perhaps, because, there was poverty. It's a whole sort of eastern belt of India that they went from. And so I guess destitution would be one answer, combined with a bit of opportunity as well. But Mohanlal was what they call a passenger Indian. This distinction is, very well known in South Africa and in Mauritius. So it talks about the free, a voluntary passenger. Someone who went not as an indentured laborer under a government scheme, but someone who paid his own passage, and so that's a passenger Indian. And there were two kinds. Mainly, there were the traders and the retailers. Who went to service the indentured community. And there were educated people, teachers, and in between there were the sort of blue-collar workers who went to work in the diamond and gold discoveries, led by that. But Gandhi was a passenger Indian, you can say, but he was an educated person, and there were very few of those. Mohanlal, my great-grandfather, was also an educated man. He was an aspiring interpreter. But the interesting thing is that when I look at what led to this passenger Indian rush, it was like a contagion. So I went to these villages in Surat, just outside Surat, from where a whole lot of people just went off. I mean, they say, it's as if it just suddenly, like wildfire, the news caught of this place in the Transvaal where gold had been found, and they just set off. And these were kind of semi-literate. They were really not educated, very poor. But the cotton boom had just taken place in India. And so there was some money, some profits, which they could probably use to buy a ticket. And they were all very affected by Queen Victoria's proclamation of 1858, which said that the empire is for all. So I imagine my great-grandfather also deeply kind of affected. He's a young man, probably ambitious, and thinking of himself as part of this empire, not limited or bound by geography, but with this huge geography opening up to him.
Yeah. To what extent did the British Empire play a role here, Sunil? Because, when I was looking at the story of Gujaratis, a lot of them ended up being, the shroffs and, playing the role of a money lender or opening up dukas in East Africa, for example. So to what extent were they the foot soldiers of the empire?
I think one of the biggest questions is what the relationship is between the much older history of migration from particularly South India to Southeast Asia, and then what happens when the British impose their dominance on that part of the world. And what you have is, to begin with, the British actually tried to insert themselves into some of these existing networks. They used some of the same networks of recruitment for labor, for example, that were already in operation on a much, much smaller scale. But then they take it over. And the scale of migration just is transformed in the 19th century, particularly after 1857, particularly in the 1860s and 1870s. And then you see a step change in the magnitude of migration. And I think one of the interesting contrasts we can draw is between Tamil migration to Southeast Asia and Chinese migration to Southeast Asia. It's happening at exactly the same time. It's happening on pretty much the same scale. And the biggest difference is that most Chinese migrants are going to work for Chinese employers. And most Tamil migrants, particularly those going to the plantations, but even those going to the urban economy, are working for white British planters, capitalists, employers. And so the British colonial state is very much overseeing this migration. There's also internal conflict within the British Empire over migration. And I think the South African story is an even better example of that. But by the 20th century, you have the government of Malaya, which is another British colonial government, saying we need more labor. And the British government of India saying, no, we don't want to send any more labor out of India because people are being ill-treated there. So you even get, alongside the early stirrings of nationalist critique of the way that labor is being exploited overseas, there are even these internal divisions which are intercolonial divisions about the rights of subjects in different places. And it all goes back to what Amrita was just saying about the rhetorical proclamation that anyone in the empire can go anywhere, and then the reality that this is very, very heavily segmented in different ways.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things is that, Freer, who was the governor of Bombay and also therefore looked after Middle East and Africa, one of the things he said, he was just surprised how many Gujaratis, as he puts it, he finds in the region. And Gisbert Unk, who works a lot on East African communities, he actually interviews the Karimji Jivanji family. And during the conversation, he finds talking to them that they are telling them that Freer apparently tells them that, oh, so you want to use the Brits in order to have global markets. He said, no, you're the middlemen. We always had these markets, and you come into the picture. So I just wanted to play on that there is that kind of chutzpah, that confidence about how one goes about it. So tell me, in terms of when you looked at the Indian communities in South Africa and Mauritius, and you saw it, of course, in the post-apartheid period, when there has been a lot of aggressiveness, what kind of attitude exists? Because there has been resentment, both in East Africa and in Southeast Asia. I want to come to that too, against the Indian community. I mean, the cling and, word are not positive terms, they're pejorative terms. And same with, there are Swahili proverbs which are very critical of Indian traders. I was just curious if you wanted to speak about that.
Yeah, I tried not to look at the contemporary just because I thought I'll just get so caught up in it. But yes, the tensions between, I mean, the sort of animosity between, you know, the Indian community and the Native Africans. There is, you can feel the sort of tension. And I suppose that is a product of the history because Indians came in, I mean, you know, India was, of course, colonized as well. So it's a peculiar situation where you have a colonized people going to another country and then becoming sort of semi-colonizers, and they were seen as middlemen. Now, I'm not quite sure they were because though they did go as shopkeepers and traders, but they did service both. They serviced all. You know, there were shops were visited by white people and by